Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Salagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. This week on The Final Straw, we're sharing a chat that Scott had with Smirk, Wink, and Nudge of the Camp Grayling Offensive, an anarchist effort to oppose the doubling expansion of the largest military base on Turtle Island, based in so-called Michigan. For the hour, the militants talk about the ecological, social, economic, and other potential impacts of expanding the military-industrial complex, and the counterinsurgency training ground in particular. You can learn more at twitter.com/GraylingCamp. Soon at a blog that they'll be starting, and or on one of their upcoming info tours. There'll be more information in the show notes about upcoming dates.
I'm really happy to be talking to you today about what's going on at Camp Grayling. And first off, just would you be able to introduce yourselves with whatever name you want to use and pronouns, and what your associations are that you want to share?
Yeah. I'm Smirk. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm with the Stop Camp Grayling Offensive.
Hi, I'm Wink. I use she, her pronouns, and I am with the Stop Camp Grayling Offensive.
Hi, I'm Nudge. I use she, they pronouns, and I am also with the Camp Grayling Offensive.
Great. Thank you so much for being here and talking with us today. So just to give a little bit of background, can you describe what Camp Grayling is and the expansion that you're trying to block?
Yeah. Camp Grayling is the largest military base on Turtle Island, and they're looking to expand it to twice its size. On the base, they will be testing and training in new surveillance warfare, space warfare, and like counterinsurgency, and new autonomous vehicles. Right now, it like threatens two major watersheds and is now entering a whole nother one. And yeah, it's sort of devastating at all of its intersections.
So currently, all branches of the military train at Camp Grayling. Also, local and state law enforcement trains at Camp Grayling. And currently, but also with the expansion, is planned to have paramilitary and private weapons manufacturers train and test their weapons at Camp Grayling, and with the expansion, that will also be expanded.
So how do you think how does the Camp Grayling compare to other training sites? Like, I'm thinking, that there's the action to stop the Cop City in Atlanta, for example. And then also, just on top of that question, I'm wondering about the National Guard, because in the zine that you all put together, you talk specifically about the National Guard using that land and what their sort of history is.
I think that definitely our struggle is really connected to the Cop City struggle. They use the base to train state police and to train specifically in counterinsurgency. The National Guard is the oldest wing of the so-called U.S. military, and their legacy is like to basically establish new settler colonies and to enforce law and order. They aided in Western expansion and the systematic genocide of indigenous folks since its conception, and has gone on to suppress like strikes and any kind of insurgent movement that has come up in the so-called United States. In so-called Michigan, yeah, they've been deployed against striking workers and have been deployed multiple times in reaction to responses to state violence and murder against Black folks, namely in like Benton Harbor and during the Detroit riots.
Given the history of the use of Camp Grayling for counterinsurgency and violent repression of uprisings, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you see at play in the expansion and how it extends the forces of empire, the state, and fascism, or any other connections you might draw.
Yeah, definitely. So, as we kind of mentioned, a lot of surveillance and counterinsurgent technologies are already tested at Camp Grayling and used by the so-called United States all across the world. And with the expansion specifically, we've heard that they're hoping to further test specifically surveillance tech. A lot of the same technology that has been tested at Camp Grayling was used during the 2020 uprising. And we're also seeing an increase in interest in like autonomous vehicles, and specifically the application of autonomous vehicles in urban warfare environments, which we can only guess what that might mean.
So in the zine that you all put together, you make some really important connections between what the U.S. military is doing and rising fascism around the world. Specifically, one of the connections you draw is with the Latvian military, and I'm just wondering if you would talk a little bit about these webs of power that you see, and what Camp Grayling's role is in that.
So the Michigan National Guard has had a pretty close relationship with the Latvian military for, I want to say, a couple decades. I don't know for sure. And the Latvian military will come to so-called Michigan often to train at Camp Grayling specifically, including during the Northern Strike exercises, which are kind of this giant conglomeration of different militaries from around the world that come to so-called Michigan to train and to kind of do this big joint training exercise. It's a show of force. And something that I think is really interesting is the proximity that Latvia has to the war in so-called Ukraine, and how one of the reasons that military officials are claiming to want the Camp Grayling expansion is because of so-called Michigan's similarities in natural terrain and climate to Eastern Europe. And so it seems very timely that as all of this money and weaponry is being funneled into so-called Ukraine, that they're wanting to expand a military base that has close ties to other far-right countries in the area, as well as to kind of weather out climate collapse and creating these fascist strongholds as we head into worse and worse weather. Yeah, I just think it's really interesting timing, to be honest.
Yeah, it's telling to me too that, like, as you're pointing out the way that they are comparing terrains, that like, and maybe, and I wonder to what extent, I don't know if you all have thoughts on this, but to what extent like the sort of the military is like thinking strategically in one way that might be different than what like the the government is doing in other ways, but there's definitely these like fascist connections between the armed forces of different countries. Yeah, I don't know. That just stood out to me. The thought that like they're like thinking about how the terrains are comparable in fighting, against sort of popular forces.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's to train people like soldiers, and also to test weapons in specific weather conditions. So it's not just, people that they're sending into these other territories. It's like weaponry and vehicles and stuff like that too. So there's this also direct tie to capitalist industry within the military-industrial complex.
Right, and that's what you were saying, that it's also, the Camp Grayling is made available to like privatized security forces too for their training and testing.
Yep. Exactly.
So in the writing that you all have, you mentioned this name, which again is like them telling us something, National All-Domain Warfighting Center. Is that a separate thing than Camp Grayling as like the military training site? That name really sticks out to me.
Yeah, it is not separate. It is the same thing. However, it is a different entity. The NADWIC, which we love to call the Nesquik, was started in 2021, and it basically operates as this interface within the National Guard to have private companies come in and have their new products tested using Camp Grayling facilities and personnel. So what they advertise is that, say you're making an EMP gun, for a wild example, you would contact the Nesquik and you have actual soldiers experiment and test the weapons or accessories or vehicles that you're hoping to manufacture at a mass scale. And then it also grants you connections to the military. So once everything passes inspection and you've created a weapon that is acceptable for the United States military, then you have the connections to secure a contract with entities like the Air Force or the Marines or the Navy or the Army, or the National Guard itself.
Do you think that there's a difference in the way that this, attempt at expansion would be received publicly, given this more military focus, even though you said that they train police there, than something that's like more police affiliated, like in Atlanta, just given the different kinds of attitudes that people have towards the military versus the police?
Yeah, I do think it would be received differently. Something that is very interesting is that people that live around the base are very pro-military, but they're also pro-outdoor sportsmanship. So a lot of people are actually against the expansion, but they're not anti-military, and they make that very clear. And there are certain instances where they do tie in the police to that, but I think that because it's the military, people are more willing to say no. But it's also kind of like out of this like patriotism that no comes from. I don't know. It's really interesting. I'm not the best at articulating it.
Yeah, that is very interesting. When you said that they feel like they support the military, but then feel maybe more able to say no. In a way, that just points out something different, because the police, whatever the police are doing in terms of getting more budgets or more weapons or more training spaces, they pose it as this like impending necessity for keeping us safe in our homeland or whatever. Whereas the military, I guess there's a little bit more space that they're like, do you have to be doing this here in our backyard where we enjoy whatever hunting or whatever they're doing there.
Exactly.
So yeah, I was just wondering if you would talk a little bit more about the usage of this Camp Grayling training space by police and prison officials.
Totally. So as we've kind of said, a lot of technologies that police and prisons employ are tested at Camp Grayling. Camp Grayling also has a law enforcement training center that I think the Michigan State Police actually kind of like headed on, and it is called the Combined Armed Collective Training Facility, and they actually do have a mock city within the Camp Grayling base already. So Cop City already exists there, and also the National Guard and the state police do joint training exercises all the time. I think they've been doing that for a couple decades, and a lot of those training exercises focus on counterinsurgents. In some propaganda that we've found, we saw that they actually hire Black actors to play protesters for the National Guard and the state police to do whatever they do with.
Wow. That's, again, telling. It's like they keep saying what they're up to us. And, right. I mean, is there what is the connection with the sort of prison industrial complex? Is there training for guards there too?
Yeah.
Correction officers?
Yes. Yep. With the Law Enforcement Training Center, all sorts of different branches, I guess you could say, of law enforcement train there, firefighters, EMTs, and correction officers that will work in prisons and jails as well.
Yeah, and also the piggyback on this too, the area around the expansion has been like used to develop extensively these massive detention centers beyond Camp Grayling. Like this bioregion is like a massive center for like carceral infrastructure, and the intersections with like the detention center in Baldwin and these other like mega prisons around the state feels really important.
And on top of all that, there is also a juvenile detention facility located within the area that Camp Grayling actually currently occupies. It's called the Shawano School, and they are a maximum security youth detention center that focuses mostly on youth that have histories of like problem sexual behavior and drug crimes. They are known to be one of the facilities with the highest rates of sexual assault on the youth by the staff of any facility in the so-called United States.
So they're locking people up for their supposed problems that they're then subjecting them to inside.
Yes.
I was wondering, just thinking about that too, like that this area holds these detention centers. Like, what, I don't think we talked about sort of geographically where Camp Grayling is in relation to like, you know, Detroit and some of the other cities in Michigan. Could you talk a little bit about like what its relationship is to the urban areas?
Yeah, definitely. This expansive area is very, very like far away from other urban centers in so-called Michigan. It's in a region that is dubbed up north, and it's mostly historically like state forest lands and forests. So it's probably 2.5 hours north from like the nearest city in like the more urbanized area of so-called Michigan.
Well, okay, so given that, maybe we can turn to talking a little bit about like the environmental impact of Camp Grayling, which you mentioned in the beginning of our conversation a little bit, but I'm wondering, you know, thinking about this as like state forest and also the kind of, you know, relationship that it has to the more urban areas. So first, like, what is the environmental impact of Camp Grayling now, and what you think would happen with the expansion, but also the way that this land is like maybe being seen as productive for industry too?
So I think it's important, first of all, to say that the land that is what the expansion would be is controlled by the DNR, and that the DNR is working on a land use agreement with the National Guard in which the DNR would lease the land to the National Guard for free. Everyone knows that the U.S. military is the largest polluter on our Earth. They emit more carbon annually than most countries do. They are historically known for dramatic habitat decrease and pollution, biodiversity losses, and all sorts of just horrible, horrible impacts to our environment. Specifically in Camp Grayling, well, and also in training centers, military training centers in general, due to the repeated acts of what just the training is, what training does, military bases and training centers are among the most polluted areas of our Earth. And Camp Grayling's no different. One of the main pollutants that have been found in Camp Grayling, and it's not been very long, it's only been since 2016 that this issue has really become prevalent in the area, is the PFAS in the groundwater. PFAS are per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're a group of manufactured chemicals that are found specifically in military bases in something called aqueous film-forming foam, AFFF, which has been used as a fire extinguishing component, as well as to do all sorts of other things like dust suppression on the roads, or they spray it all over their vehicles because it is known to be resistant to water and heat and oil. So Camp Grayling has used this aqueous film-forming foam, along with most other places in the country that trains military, since the 70s. and it is full of PFAS. PFAS is like a really horrible, it's really horrible shit. It is one of what I'm sure some people have heard about forever chemicals. PFAS, they bioaccumulate in humans and non-humans over time. So this basically synthetic chemical compound just builds up in your bloodstream. And it's been found in the groundwater in Grayling. And it is all over one specific lake that is contained within the current boundaries of Camp Grayling called Lake Margaret. And there's really it's fucked because there's not really good way to clean this out of the groundwater. And when you go to so-called Grayling in northern Michigan, everywhere you look, there are streams, there's wetlands, there's rivers. It's absolutely fucking beautiful there. But we know that the water is all connected. So-called Michigan is located in an area that has access to 20% of the world's fresh water in the so-called Great Lakes. So Camp Grayling is putting these and PFAS is just one too. There's countless hazardous chemicals that are released by the military every single fucking day. And it's going into the water, and these streams aren't just staying in Grayling, they're flowing from the wetlands into the streams, into the rivers, which will eventually flow into both Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, which has been happening at least since the 1970s. Also, another fun fact to kind of tie capitalism into it is that the military actually owns the patent to the aqueous film-forming foam, and with the mega corporation 3M worked to develop it. So anytime this foam is manufactured, the military actually is making money off of it as well.
Oh, wow. Michigan obviously has the state, Michigan has a bad reputation in terms of water and water quality, given the situation in Flint that got a lot of publicity. With this situation, is it a similar kind of response in terms of a lack of concern for the people, and obviously the people and the other living creatures there having their water be poisoned by these chemicals, or is there anything that they're doing?
Oh yeah, the response was underwhelming at best. The military has not taken any accountability. Why would they? But the people that live in so-called Grayling whose well water has been affected by this, there's really only a handful of individuals. I think it was 19 households that were able to receive well remediation by the military. There's a couple hundred households that have received water filters. Somehow Camp Grayling got off the Superfund list. I don't know how, because you can't clean that shit up. So I'm not really, it's all just a little bit shady. But yeah, there's definitely an underwhelming response to the poisoning of the water in the area by the military, 100%.
Can I add to that? The military solution to the PFAS problem is to discontinue firefighting foam, which is what they allude to as the big thing that's causing the problem, the contamination, is this firefighting foam. But really, this chemical is used in so many things that the military uses. So that solution is really inadequate.
Right, yeah. It seems like, as you were pointing out, the water doesn't stay in one place. So limiting the sort of these pretty minimal stopgap measures to help people doesn't really address a larger problem, or even acknowledge really that they're creating this problem and it's an ongoing situation. You mentioned Superfund site. Would you just talk a little bit about what that means and what it means that Camp Grayling isn't one now?
Sure. I don't know why Camp Grayling isn't one now, but I do know that a Superfund site is anywhere that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, decides is so heavily polluted and contaminated by toxic substances that it needs to be like completely shut down for remediation purposes, and that like resources need to be directed to that ASAP. And there are about, last I read, there are just over 1,300 Superfund sites in the so-called United States. Over half of them are current or former military bases or training compounds. And then other places that you're likely to see Superfund sites become are like factories or places where a lot of industrial waste was disposed. Unfortunately, here in so-called Michigan, we have the highest concentration of Superfund sites of anywhere in the country. It's really sad and disappointing, and it's definitely a direct result of industrialization and capitalism.
Right. So, I mean, given all like the environmental impact that you just described, one might think that like a tactic that could be applicable here would be one of like saving the environment, right? Of like conservation of some kind. Can you talk a little bit about that method and also why you all are critical of that approach?
Yeah, definitely. I think that in the history of like sort of environmental justice work and so-called Michigan, at least in my lived experience, has been like centered around conservation and doing paper wrenching as a method of resistance. And basically it is sort of appealing to state biases around these. Basically, there's a narrative that the state like believes in, like it demonstrates itself in social stratification and the way that capitalist society and exploitation and oppression looks, and that like the state values some lives over others, and that some lives and interests are worth protecting over others. And this is like definitely where most conservation narratives stem from. And this is also where like the like tactic of paper wrenching feels inadequate and sort of cringy to me.
Can you just explain what paper wrenching means?
Yes, it fundamentally means that we're using laws or rights that the state has told us exist and basically hold them accountable to those laws and rights. And we know that the state is not a fair or rational entity, and that it ultimately exerts power in however it wants to. And I think that appealing to rights and laws is like something that is also, just legitimizing state violence and oppression and legitimizing their worldview that aids all these oppressive structures.
Just to kind of add on to that and how conservation kind of legitimizes colonialism and extraction capitalism in this exact circumstance. As oil and gas resources were being discovered and that process was just beginning, there was this settler conservationist fight over the Pigeon River State Forest, which is just a little north of so-called Grayling, which rests on top of this giant gas shale that we have underneath the peninsula. And there's this very drawn-out fight to prevent oil and gas drilling within the state forest land. And as that fight kind of came to a close, the Michigan United Conservation Clubs reached an agreement with oil and gas executives that said that they can drill within state forest lands, so they conceded on the condition that some of the revenue gets put back into conservation efforts. And as that trust kind of developed, it became essentially a DNR fund. So a lot of the reasons that there are state forests and nature preserves surrounding so-called Grayling are because of this compromise with oil and gas execs and the love of outdoor sportsmanship by a lot of the folks that live around there made that a really appealing kind of like conservation effort, even though it allowed extraction to continue even more so than it already was at the time. And I feel like that's really important to point out here too, that like a lot of the way that conservation happens in this area is, you know, hand in hand with extraction capitalism.
Yeah, that's really helpful to draw those connections really explicitly.
This is The Final Straw, and you're hearing Scott's talk with participants in the Stop Camp Grayling Offensive campaign to stop the expansion of the largest military base on Turtle Island in so-called Michigan. More info on that on Twitter at Grayling Camp. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
You're listening to Dissident Island Radio.
Live every first and third Friday of the month at 9 p.m. GMT.
Check out www.dissidentisland.org for downloads and more.
One of the things, though, that you all talk about in the writing that you did is the possibility of like using state distinctions of endangered species or something like that as a tool of fighting the expansion. Can you talk about about that kind of tool and how you relate to it, you know, from this anti-state perspective?
Yeah, this is like probably one of the first ways people started to mobilize and take action against the expansion. And basically, right now we're in a public comment period, they're calling it, and while we sort of await the decision of politicians on whether this will be approved or not, and then we move on to an environmental impact survey phase. Basically, all of these people that are being contracted to do the surveying are state entities and like agencies that have stake in the project being completed. So the DNR is going to contract entities to do the surveying. So is the National Guard, by sort of having a grassroots initiative, even though it is like sort of a low risk, low reward tactic, and it's one that legitimizes states, it still sort of could open up a path to gum up the gears and slow down the expansion through litigation. So yeah, that's a thing that is happening. It happened.
You know, I wonder if you'd share a little bit of your knowledge about the land that Camp Grayling occupies in terms of the history of indigenous relationship to the land and the history of settlement and colonization that's gone on, because that seems to be an important backdrop to everything that you're saying.
Yeah, definitely. The original stewards of most of Michigan, if not all, are the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi people. They make up the Council of the Three Fires. The land that is currently Camp Grayling and the land that is in the expansion is entirely covered under the Treaty of Washington of 1836. The Treaty of Washington gave specifically Ojibwa and Odawa people hunting and fishing rights. And the U.S. military and Camp Grayling has been in violation of these rights since its inception in 1913. There's not really like a huge native population in the area as of now. The reservations tend to be north and west and south and east of this area for whatever reason. But I think something that's important to talk about is the land that so-called Grayling sits on is kind of cut by two different rivers, the so-called Au Sable and the so-called Manistee River, both kind of like carve what is now known as Grayling. And these were really important waterways to indigenous folks for centuries prior to colonization. And then once settlers came and began occupying this area, what they were really attracted to was the huge old growth forests that were there, and immediately just fucking cut them all down. And then they used the waterways to ship the logs all over. And the logging history of Grayling is really directly tied to Camp Grayling because the lumber baron, Rasmus Hansen, was one of the original kind of like capitalists in the area of so-called Grayling. And it was customary at the time for logging companies or any other extractive companies to kind of pay their taxes by donating the land back to the state. So the whole reason Camp Grayling exists is because Rasmus Hansen cut down all the old trees on it and then gave it back to the state of Michigan in order to open up a National Guard training center. So that's kind of the lore. Unfortunately, a lot of indigenous history has been lost to colonization, and we are working on building relationships with indigenous folks that might have some of this knowledge, this ancestral knowledge of the land. But as we know, a lot of their history has been completely destroyed by settler colonization.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I guess it's important to know also that you said that the people who had originally lived there have been like really driven off the land. It makes me, wonder about who the residents are in that area. We talked a little bit about their, military support, but is there more information you could share about like who lives in the area?
The folks that live in the area, and they're mostly settlers, and there's a lot of class diversity as I understand it, but there are a lot of poor white folks and that are affected by like the ecological issues. But there are also just like rich bastards that have a lot of land. Yeah, I don't know. It's mostly, just like a NIMBY settler population, frankly.
Something that's important to that settler population are also industries created by the river systems. So trophy fishing, like fly fishing and trout fishing are really, really popular, and people travel from all over the world to come to the headwaters of the so-called Au Sable to fly fish. And so that tourism and other kind of like recreational activities along the rivers are really, really important to the economic well-being of like a largely poor, conservative, white populace. And a lot of those folks see the expansion as a direct threat to that tourism and to their economic well-being, and hopefully to the rivers also, but who knows?
Yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit then about how, the groups that are organizing resistance to Camp Grayling relate to the people living there. Like, is there any kind of collaboration? Are you taking different strands if there are people resisting who are living there for different reasons they want to oppose it? I'd just be interested to know about what connections or divergences there are.
There are a lot of different groups organizing around the issue. They tend to be affiliated with like far right aligning folks. A lot of the stuff that they're doing is sort of like petition work and awareness. They have a very large Facebook following, very impressive. But they are, they're pro-military and they are anti-direct action. And I think that the Stop Camp Grayling Offensive is more trying to introduce a anti-military anarchist contingency to the issue. And really trying to like not only like focus on stopping the expansion, but like trying to center other issues like land back and anti-military as a whole, and to destroy the military industrial complex and the state as a whole. And even though I think I like brought the most attention to like the far right contingents that are involved in the project, I do want to say that there are like other more liberal contingents there at all as well, but they're also sort of using the same strategies that center the state to meet their ends.
Some settler conservation groups have also gotten involved. Groups like Trout Unlimited, Sierra Club. There's like a Michigan Conservation Club. So these are kind of seen as legitimate by almost everyone, like in any political party or whatever, for being like kind of experts in this conservation stuff. So they have also kind of come to the table to mostly ask for transparency in the environmental impact surveying that will be happening maybe in the next couple of years.
And to be frank, I think that these other contingencies that exist of locals, they don't like us and are antagonistic to us.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me the way that you sort of stake out your like an anarchist space to reject this project that doesn't imagine a useful tactic of collaborating with people who don't sort of share that sort of interconnected, let's say, view of how all of these, the military and the extractive resources, the settler state, all these things like connect. I wonder if you talk just like about that sort of strategy on your end of sort of a separate campaign to stop Camp Grayling's expansion, and what you think it offers for anarchists to not water down their view of things in the projects that we do.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of times when I'm thinking about this, I am thinking about what it means to be in solidarity with folks who might not even live in the so-called United States, but are still being hunted down and persecuted by its empire. And I am also a trans person, and it's difficult for me to begin with to share spaces with a lot of these like far-right contingencies in this fight.
Yeah.
I would be almost immediately othered. And so I'm unwilling to compromise with people who are anti-trans. I'm unwilling to compromise with people who are explicitly anti-Black. I'm unwilling to compromise with people who love the military. And I think that a lot of anarchist organizing in the past decade has done a lot of watering down analysis in order to win small victories. And I might be alone in this, but I am just observing that it's not working, and that so much movement building and campaigning is so much more alienating than people like to talk about. And in my experience doing other kinds of work the thing that is not alienating is when you are honest about what your goals are and why you're working towards the things you're working toward. And that people who might be sympathetic to anarchists or anti-state communists or whatever are much more excited about actions or analysis that reflect this uncompromising belief in the destruction of the so-called United States. And it just feels so much more empowering to aim for that and to be formulating strategy around that than to be fighting to just stop a Camp Grayling expansion or to just stop a pipeline. And yeah, so it's something that's really invigorating to me, and I've observed it being invigorating to others. And yeah, I just think it's good solidarity to be against the United States empire as a whole instead of just a specific part of it.
Yeah, I really like how you put all that together, especially highlighting sort of the anti-trans, anti-black offensives that are going on around the country now. It seems really important to bring those things together with these other issues that could seem that they're not connected, right? That like anti-transness are sort of the state racism isn't connected to extractive resources, expansion of the military. But yeah, I think that's just super important, just to center that. And also I like how you frame it too, just thinking about, trans people like doing this kind of work and showing that like a trans issue isn't, asking the state to recognize us. Right. It's like, it's fighting the state that's trying to destroy the world.
Yeah. Yup. Yeah. Anti-trans bigotry and anti-black bigotry are the United States war machine.
Right. Yeah. Well said. Well, so given like the sort of, the unwillingness to compromise this kind of, this encompassing analysis and approach, I wonder if you would connect the way that you're framing this struggle with other struggles going on in Michigan, as you mentioned, like the Line 5 or the pipeline struggles, or elsewhere too. We've mentioned obviously already the Atlanta forest. So like what connections you might see in the way that you're doing this to other things that are ongoing, if any?
So-called Grayling is only about, I want to say, 100 miles south of the Straits of Mackinac, which is where Enbridge hopes to build a big old tunnel to put a new pipeline through called Line 5. Many people probably remember the fight against Line 3. Enbridge is now hoping to build this tunnel underneath the straits to house a new pipeline, again called Line 5. And there's a lot of folks that have been resisting that for years. However, we're starting to see a lot of those people kind of get comfy with Stop Camp Grayling stuff and learning how our struggles can unify, or maybe unify isn't the right word, it can benefit from one another, whether that be building supply lines or teaching each other new skills, having a multiplicity of people willing to work on stuff. And so I'm personally really excited to see connections to that fight. Something else too is in the Upper Peninsula. In 2009, there was a fight for Eagle Rock, which is a sacred site along the coast of so-called Lake Superior. And a company called Kennecott wanted to mine nickel sulfide there, and were ultimately successful in crushing the land defense efforts. However, there was a really interesting campaign around it. Just earlier this year, Kennecott sold the property rights to the land parcel to a company called Talons Metals, who hopes to open up a huge swath of the Upper Peninsula to nickel mining, specifically to build batteries for Tesla, which again, coming back to military-industrial complex, a lot of the military is trying to switch to renewable energies, including electric vehicles. So not only are our struggles interlinked because of the geography and the people who might be involved, but also because nickel mining is something that the military is also really excited about.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if this is a direct answer to your question, but I'm going to try. Yeah, I think I'm really excited about this particular offensive because it feels like it's super, super, super easy to draw connections to all of the issues. For instance, like we're like sort of we had initially gotten a lot of inspiration from the Shack and Defend Atlanta Forest strategy of tertiary targeting. And as we were sort of like identifying what breathes life into Camp Grayling, as we identified like new targets and new threats and enemies, we would identify 3 more connected to those, and then 3 more. And ultimately, we saw that like everything breathes life. Like the world that created Camp Grayling is the same world that builds pipelines that are putting these facial recognition cameras outside of shops in Detroit, that, you know, and like the intersections with like Michigan Department of Corrections. I think that what's been exciting is that a militant attack against anything that exists in the settler colony is an action against Camp Grayling and the world that it protects. And yeah, I don't know, that's been really inspiring.
Yeah, that's that's a helpful way of like thinking about it too. Like that this one space kind of locates all of these forces that are interconnecting in a really telling way. I'm wondering if there's anything you could share about like what sort of, you know, ideas of approaches that you're going to take in stopping the expansion. If there's anything, you know, that you are able to talk about.
Yeah, I think like sort of what I was sort of like hinting at and like touching on just a moment ago was like an idea that some folks in the Camp Grayling effort have been like exploring and talking about, which is what we've dubbed offensive strategy, and that it's basically decentralizing targets altogether, where every like niche of settler colonial life is a target for militant action, and that you can do a solidarity action with Camp Grayling by just, you know, throwing by just like making that connection either like through words or in your communique or whatever. It's like just like let Stop Camp Grayling sponsor your militancy, and vice versa. That's sort of just like, I guess a quick overview of that like strategy that's being explored. There are also just like more like we're really inspired by Defend Atlanta Forest too, and so like this is we have the intention of being decentralized, of not really telling people what tactics they should or shouldn't use. So I think that also like means that like more like campaign type organizing is happening along like parallel to our offensive strategy. There are some that like are more like modeled like pretty, some folks that are like really modeling after Defend Atlanta Forest and like tertiary targeting strategy outside of an offensive structure. So like actually targeting clear contracting like forces too. Mm-hmm. So like more like instead of generalized antagonism, it's more of like like pointed antagonism. So it just looks so different depending on who you're fucking around with.
Yeah, just to kind of like round that out, there are folks who are working on movement building in urban areas in so-called Michigan. There are folks who want to give out free food just like Enbridge does. There are folks who want to do parties in the forest. There are folks who want to do sabotage actions. There's folks who want to do petitioning and paper wrenching. There's a huge multiplicity of tactics being talked about, but because this is a very, very baby offensive, there's not a lot to show for it yet, but we are very excited.
Well, if people wanted to, contribute either with their time, presence, or resources, is there a way that they could plug in?
We think everyone should make their own decisions on how to do that. If people want to have more information about what's going on, really good resources are social media. There are Twitter and Instagram pages, and I don't know if it's helpful for me to say them or if, I guess I can say them, right? The Instagram is...
We'll link them too,
Yes. The Instagram is Stop Camp Grayling, and the Twitter is Grayling Camp. That's the handle there. And those are updated really frequently. And there's also a Proton mail people can reach out to if they have specific questions and don't have social media. I think that's Stop Camp Grayling. Yeah. Stop Camp Grayling at Proton Mail. But really, we encourage people to figure out kind of like what they can do to get involved and just, brand it for themselves as Stop Camp Grayling. Anything can be Stop Camp Grayling, kind of like what we already established. So, we want everyone to make their own decisions.
And I think also just like the plug a thing, like we have been doing, well, not we, but folks in our in our offensive have been organizing talking tours to like go to like different communities and sort of help people brainstorm and vision what plugging into a Stop Camp Grayling Offensive might look like. And there are that's happening pretty regularly where folks are going out and meeting with those communities that have asked for it.
Is there information about where you'll be speaking, like on your social media?
Yep.
And I would also just say that, you shared the zine, The Base Among the Jack Pine, Notes on the Camp Grayling Expansion on Anishinaabe, and I thought that was a just great piece of writing, so we'll link to that too in our notes for the show.
Thank you.
So, is there anything else that you want to share, or anything that we didn't get to, highlight or focus on that you think is important?
Fuck the state.
Yep. Well, that's probably a good place to end on. I really appreciate all the work you're doing and all the information that you shared and taking the time to talk with us. And this is a really important front for our ongoing long struggle. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us so much. I love Final Straw.
Yeah, we love you too.
Yay. Yeah, cool. Well, thank you. And hopefully we'll have you on again with any updates and when you have more stuff to share.
That would be awesome.
This is The Final Straw. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.